All right. So welcome back to sociological theory. Um, this week we are covering early American social thought, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about Black social thought. We're also going to talk about feminist social thought, and then, you know, engage in some literature that kind of deals with the combination of, of both. So we're first going to start with the Black social thought and looking at both David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens, as well as Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Okay? So those are two pieces that I think are very important when talking about particularly early Black social thought. Um, then we're going to go into the Declaration of Sentiments, which was used to help lay the foundation. It was almost kind of like the Constitution. Well, really, it was laid from or modeled after the Declaration of Independence. So it's kind of like the Declaration of Independence for women, right? And it kind of laid the foundation for early and even later feminist thought and feminism. So we're going to look at that. And then we're also going to engage with Patricia Hill Collins' work, Black Feminist Thought, where she looks at mammies, matriarchs, et cetera, and looking at the way in which Black women's work gets exploited. So we'll engage with that as well. So with that being said, you can go ahead and pull up your PowerPoint, which is found in the PowerPoint section, Files. If you go to Files and then you go to PowerPoint, you'll be able to see the PowerPoint for this lecture. Let's see. So first slide, theory or consciousness. So when we think about certain ways of thinking, right? Even when we think about thought, like what is thought? Is thought a theory or is thought a consciousness? So when we think about like Black nationalist thought, or when we think about feminist thought, are these theories or is this a way of raising the consciousness of the people? Not only the people in which these theories or thoughts or consciousnesses or ways of thinking reflect, but also the people that challenge the folks that reflect this thought, right? So I think that's the first question. Is this early American social thought, are these theories or is this a consciousness? And then what is the difference? And so this is just a way of kind of setting the stage and framing this conversation. A theory is a way in which a phenomena is explained, right? A way in which phenomena is explained. That is generally what we think about when we think about a theory, right? So when you think about conflict theory by Marx explains what is happening. It explains the tension between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and how that leads to social change, how that leads to social formation and social reformation throughout our society, throughout our world. Our world changes based on the interactions between the rich and the poor. That's a theory. I don't know if it raises the consciousness, because if you think about what consciousness is a way of thinking that translates to a way of acting. Right now, while the theory might be conflict theory, the consciousness may be, I don't know, communism or something like that, right? Like something that actually leads to action. Socialism, maybe. Something that actually leads to some kind of an action, right? So that's one of the differences between theory and consciousness. Theory explains the phenomena. Consciousness does the same, talks about a way of thinking within a phenomena, and then how that can be translated into action. So theory, again, explains why something is the way it is. Consciousness explains the thoughts or feelings of an individual. right? Theory is a proposed explanation. This explains why this thing is happening. Consciousness does an internal assessment of the knowledge and awareness of something. So consciousness just goes a little bit deeper. You can explain why something is happening, and then you can really go inside and raise the awareness and really assess the depth around the people who are affected by this thing, right? Theory, a view or conception of something to be done or a method of completing it. Where in consciousness is an increased awareness of one's behavior, history, needs, and attitudes, etc. So systemic racism theory is a theory because it explains why racism continues to exist and how racism is perpetuated within society, even when it appears that people are no longer racist. Black Lives Matter is a consciousness. Black Lives Matter is a way in which people are trying to increase awareness about some behavior, the history around this behavior, the attitudes around people who think a certain way. There's this way of thinking of number one, saying Black Lives Matter. These people matter. These people are human, number one. Black Lives Matter is basically just saying these people are human. They're human beings, so they should be treated as such. And then it translates into action because it is a rallying cry. So when you hear Black Lives Matter, you automatically think protests, rebellion, marches, most of the time peaceful, but sometimes there could be non-peaceful things happening. I don't know if it's violence. I think of violence and riots. I think of something much bigger, you know, setting something on fire, something small on fire, or whatever, a car on fire. I guess that could be considered violent, but sometimes I think about something much bigger. When you think about like the LA riots, where like whole parts of the city were being burned down. And typically those don't have anything to do with the people who are organizing Black Lives Matter marches, right? So again, Black Lives Matter could be a certain level of consciousness based off of theories, systemic racism theory, et cetera, right? So that's the difference, right, between theory and consciousness. The difference between theory and consciousness. So the question then is, when we're talking about these theories that we're getting ready to discuss, or when we're talking about these ideas, these concepts that we're getting ready to discuss, that's a question that we should continue to grapple with. When we talk about David Walker's appeal, we talk about what to say was the 4th of July, talk about feminist theory. Is feminism a theory or is it a consciousness? Right. So I think that's something for us to consider. We will move on. So this slide, next slide, 2 forms of Black social thought, theory or consciousness. So David Walker wrote Appeal to the Colored Citizens. And there's a reason why I chose for you to read this reading, and I wanted to engage with this reading. Number one, David Walker would be considered probably one of the forefathers of Black nationalism. So when you think about Black social thought, there's 2 kind of paths that one can go down, right? And these are early forms of like American Black social thought. African social thought prior to Black people being kidnapped and brought to the United States, much, much, much longer, all right? But we're talking about from the maybe 19th century on, okay? And so when we're thinking about these early forms of Black American social thought, and the ways in which both groups are resisting and what they feel is necessary for resistance and what they feel is necessary for being able to see liberation, see equality, particularly for Black people, that can then be translated into all people. There's two kind of major frameworks. You have the Black nationalist path, and then you have the civil rights path. And we're going to deal with both of these, Black nationalist path and the civil rights path. All right. Now, the Black nationalist path, some people would say that David Walker's appeal is kind of like your earlier form of Black nationalism. And we'll see what they're getting at. You'll begin to understand, especially when we go to the next slide, how there's this difference. And then we'll start to talk about people that you may be more familiar with that you can now see this kind of difference, okay? So David Walker, he was an American abolitionist, he was a writer, he was an anti-slavery activist. He was born in, I believe it was North Carolina, the late 18th century. His father was enslaved, but his mother was free. So he was in a very unique position because during this time, there were laws that were early so-called slave laws stated that if you were born to a parent who was free, then you could be free. All right. But what that ended up doing was it ended up making it difficult for white men to essentially rape Black women. All right. Again, early law said if any of your parents were born free, you were free when African people were first brought to this country. What a lot of the early lawmakers didn't realize was that, oh, these white men want to sleep with these African women. And when they were raping them, these women would get pregnant. But now if the women get pregnant, then the children are free. So now you got a whole bunch of free Black people in the United States. So they say, oh, we didn't think about that part. Sorry. Then they went back and they changed the laws. And the law stated, you maintain the status of the mother. So whatever status the mother is, that's what you are. So what did that do? That made it, that was twofold. That was a win-win, particularly for men. Because number one, it allowed for men to rape Black women, have babies, and still enslave the kids. So they could still make money. They can get their sexual needs met and they can get their economic needs met. Cool. So actually it's kind of threefold. And then on top of that, they could control the sexuality of the white woman. Because now white women who got pregnant by an enslaved man, that would then disrupt the economy of slavery. Because now you're reproducing a Black person that's free. That doesn't help us. So you're now less likely to see something like that happen. You're less likely to see a free, particularly a free white woman, get pregnant by an enslaved Black man, right? So that law was very, very important. Now, going back to David Walker, it's not really sure what the race, we know that he was Black, but we're not sure if his mother was Black and free and his father was Black and enslaved, or that his father was enslaved. We know if his father was enslaved, his father was Black, or if his mother was Black, but she was free, right? But more than, well, we just don't know. But in North Carolina, we know North Carolina had a very, very, very large slave population, right? But she could have been a Black free woman, who knows? Regardless, his mother was free, his father was enslaved. So he was in a unique position because very rarely did enslaved Black people have free mothers. So because of that, based on the law, he was born free. And so he was born free and he stayed in North Carolina. He grew up in North Carolina. Well, we'll get to that in a second. But he was born free. And in 1829, he was living in Boston, Massachusetts. when he got much older, maybe like in his late 20s, early 30s. He moved to Boston, Massachusetts. And there he published something called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And it was this publication that called for Black unity, called for a fight against slavery. And so the appeal was very significant because what it did was it brought attention to the disgust, the inhumanity, the immorality of slavery and the inequalities that Black people lived under. And he used several different methods of addressing the atrocities of slavery, particularly attacking the religious and political principles of the United States. Now, David Walker wasn't the first person to do this. All right, there were people who spoke out against slavery, and especially as you get closer to the 19th century and after the Haitian Revolution, after Nat Turner's Rebellion, like as you're getting closer to the Civil War, you got quite a few people speaking out at this point. So he wasn't the first person, but the way in which he did it was so bold, especially living in the South. He was in Boston by this time, but even being in Boston, just because slavery didn't exist in Boston at the time doesn't mean white supremacy wasn't an issue, and he talks about that as well. And so this man was very bold in his approach. Most people didn't talk this way. He was unafraid. Well, he appeared to be unafraid. And so a lot of Southern citizens were very upset at Walker's viewpoints because his ideas were very revolutionary. You can see that in the reading. And I only gave you all a snippet. The actual appeal is very long. I just gave you all a snippet of the appeal. But it's actually really long. And his viewpoints are very, very, very revolutionary. And Southern citizens were so upset at how this was done that they literally banned the circulation of the publication. They banned the circulation of David Walker's appeal in the South. So kind of going back, and then we'll get to the appeal in a second. David Walker grew up in North Carolina. And because he grew up in North Carolina and he grew up free, he had access to knowledge, he had access to a business acumen that most Black people, particularly Black people who were enslaved, did not have. And so he owned clothing stores, and he was roughly a middle-class Black person. He helped the needy, and then also he aided Black people in running away to freedom. He aided whenever Black folks was running. He was one of those people who they could stop and talk to, and he would help them get from his point to the next point. So he used his privilege, his free privilege, to provide freedom and provide help for other people, Black people and poor white people. So eventually, because things were continuing to get really, really bad in North Carolina, even for free Black people, he eventually moved to Boston. And it was in Boston where he joined the Masonry Association. It was in Boston where he found his enclave. He found this enclave of Black, educated individuals, activists who were actively seeking to end the system of slavery in the United States. Very similar to what was found in Philadelphia. Philadelphia had this very large Black enclave of educated intellectuals, activists, and David Walker just fit right in there. He was like, wow, this is the place for me. And so it was there that he wrote his appeal to the colored citizens. He wrote this publication. And this is very significant because to write a publication, to get it published and to get it out, this was the way of communication. This was how people got information out. This was social media. This was TV. This was radio of its time. And so this was very, very big. And so David Walker began to write his appeal. And assuming that you read the appeal, I just want to go over a few things that are necessary to talk about in terms of his thematic premises. Okay. And then you can start to see why this can be considered early forms of Black nationalism. Black nationalism as an early form of social thought, Black social thought, Black American social thought, Black nationalism, the idea that Black people should and can essentially separate from white people and form their own nation and do for themselves and be completely liberated from white people and then liberate themselves and rise among themselves without necessarily having to live or work or be around white folks, right? Black nationalism is essentially the idea that Black people can have their own nation and can run their own nation. And so David Walker addresses certain themes around, or uses certain themes to address the issues of slavery. And one of them was that he spoke against, number one, the Black inferiority and Black skin being signified as inferiority. So one thing about David Walker's appeal is he's not just talking about slavery. Yes, slavery is an issue, but he's also talking about, we'll talk about this later on, white supremacy and white domination. A lot of people were anti-slavery, but they were still pro-white supremacy and pro-white domination. So he spoke against both. He's saying this idea that my skin automatically makes me inferior. Number one, we gotta get rid of that altogether. We have to get rid of that. That idea can no longer exist because it's not true. And Black skin is not inferior, white skin is not inferior, no skin is inferior. All skin is equal under the eyes of God. And so he spoke against this continual perpetuation of Black inferiority by the white mainstream system. He also promoted African-American history being an extension of African history. So, and later on, Marcus Garvey would do the same thing, but David Walker was among the first to show his knowledge of ancient Egypt and to show that ancient Egypt they were Black. And these ancient Egyptians, these people that ruled the world for so long, were Black people, and this was a part of his history, his lineage. He encouraged Black people to connect themselves to Africa and connect themselves to that history, that their history did not start in 1619. Their history did not start when they were brought over on slave ships. That's not where the Black American story starts. That's a part of the Black American story, but it does not start there. And so he encourages Black people, and he encourages white folks to also see that Black people's history, African American history, is both African history and their history in the Americas. Also, we see in this writing that David Walker criticizes both slavery again and white domination towards free Black people. So he had a very unique experience because most Black people, most enslaved Black people at this time thought that once I get free, things will be better. Slavery was the bottom of the bottom. And so if I get free, then I'll be very much equal to white people. David Walker says, I was born free. I know what it's like to be free. And we're still a far cry from equality. Far cry from equality. He understood that enslaved Black people saw it that way because they had never seen anything else. But he saw how enslaved Black people living in North Carolina. You see that's wrong very clearly, but just because you become free doesn't necessarily mean you'll be treated the same. And it's interesting because that line of thinking goes into a lot of the Black middle class research that we see. It's a lot of research on Black poverty and a lot of people who may live in poverty. Man, once I get a little bit of money, things will be better. But then you look at the Black middle class research and you find, oh no, still very, very, very much a problem. Class does not absolve racial issues. Social status, according to David Walker, does not absolve racial issues. And so he said the issue is not just slavery, it's white domination in general, it's white racism in general. And these are the things that we need to address. Once you end slavery, now you got to get rid of that part too. And that's the part of America's history and America's fabric that Fagan talks about in Racist America. If you've ever read that, if not, I think we'll read that at some point this semester, where he gets into systemic racism and how systemic racism is a part of the fabric of the country. He also encourages Black people to resist oppression. He encourages Black people to resist oppression, right? So his argument is that almost whatever means necessary, however it is that Black people need to obtain freedom and get out of being oppressed, take that road. Now, you did have a lot of especially well-known leaders that preferred to use more safe language. They didn't want to stir up any troubles. They didn't necessarily want to be violent. And you obviously see this more of a nonviolent approach take shape later on. During slavery times, it's kind of difficult on either side to be nonviolent because the essence of slavery is violent. So it's kind of difficult to look to be free without being violent. But David Walker was very vehement about however it is that you need to get free, you do that to be free. You do that to be from under oppression. So dealing with that, dealing with criticizing both slavery and white domination, promoting African-American and African history, speaking out against Black inferiority. And this speaking out against Black inferiority was very important because Jefferson had just wrote a piece having these negative views about Black people. He had just written it. So literally for David Walker to publish this is to go against, I don't know if Jefferson had already been president at that time or was president, I can't remember, but to go against a very, very high white American official, white US official, somebody who either was president or will be president of the whole country. And he's speaking out against those words. That's big because Black people weren't considered citizens. So this idea of free speech that we have now where you can criticize the president if you want, oh no. A Black person at that time doing that, you had to be really, really, really brave. And so he challenged Jefferson's negative views. Okay. Also, if we look at, let's see, which are we on? Oh yeah, encourage Black people to resist oppression. Also, he also said, don't just pray the oppression away. One of the tools that was used to keep enslaved Africans pacified was religion. If you ever know the story of Nat Turner, religion was very significant in the lives of enslaved Black people. And that was purposeful. White people allowed for religion to allow for Black people to have a certain level of freedom in religion, although they control the religion for a reason, because they actually use religion to help continue to keep them subjugated, telling them, you know what? It says in the Bible, slaves obey your masters. Just pray. Just keep praying for freedom. Don't worry about having freedom on this side. The Bible says you'll have freedom in the hereafter when you get to heaven. All of these very passive ideas around freedom was taught to enslaved Black Christians. It was taught in Black Christianity. And sometimes it was taught by the Black pastors who didn't know any better. And then, and the Black pastors on the plantations, they were seen as high figures, respected people. And so David Walker is saying no, both to the white pastors who are preaching this and to the Black pastors who are preaching this. We're not just going to pray this thing away. There has to be resistance in whatever way we see it. We write about it, write anti-slavery sentiments, preach anti-slavery sentiments, fight if we have to, set something on fire, revolt, rebel, run away, whatever you have to do. fight to get out of this system of oppression. And so he heavily criticized the religious views of the day, which was, again, was very, very, very important. Also, Walker did not just challenge the actions of white people, but he also challenged the actions of Black people. And he said, Black folks, especially those who are free, practice individual moral improvement. He believed in what's called racial uplift. We'll probably get to that at some point, I'm pretty sure. I don't think there's a particular reading, but within the readings, especially around like the early part of the 20th century, when you talk about Black social thought, racial uplift theory is a very important and significant part of that way of thinking, both in Black nationalism as well as in the civil rights tradition. So Walker, so he believed in uplifting the race, and he believed that Black people, when given the opportunity, should seek moral improvement, shouldn't be out there participating, drinking alcohol, shouldn't be, make sure you get a family, should not be having illicit sex, should go to church, the right church that preaches the right word, go to school, get an education, have regular work habits, self-regulation, all of these things that are necessary to be a good, moral, upstanding human being. Okay. And he also challenged the education and religion of the time. He believed that education and religion were two ways that were very significant in how Black people would eventually be liberated. So he was very big on education and religion. He was a very religious man, but he just didn't like the white-centered religion that preached white domination. And then lastly, he said white people should not get credit for providing equality. He asserted that whites did not deserve this kind of praise for their willingness to free some so-called slaves. And it's a good possibility he was probably talking to Jefferson then. He probably had some kind of beef with Jefferson. Because a lot of people praised Jefferson for freeing enslaved Black people, and he impregnated one that he took care of. Walker saying that doesn't make you a good human being, Dad. You shouldn't have been, this shouldn't exist in the first place. That's the bare minimum of not enslaving people. That's the bare minimum of humanity. So white people shouldn't get credit for providing equality. These are very, very radical thoughts. We might think that today, yeah, that makes sense. But there are even some thoughts today that are considered to be radical that are right along this same kind of position. And so it's very important that we realize that in David Walker saying these things in the early 19th century, this put a lot of fear in a lot of white Southerners and even some Black people, a lot of fear. And so again, you have early scholars like Sterling Stuckey. Sterling Stuckey is a distinguished professor at the University of California, Riverside. And Stuckey argues that Walker's appeal would be the ideological foundation for Black nationalist theory. Going back to now, is it theory or is it consciousness? Some people may say Black nationalism is a theory and Black consciousness is the consciousness. Maybe it goes hand in hand. I don't know. Again, there's no right or wrong answer to that. Just something to think about as you're listening to this lecture, as you're reading this PowerPoint. And again, what David Walker is putting forth, people are saying this is too radical. Even some Black people are saying this is too radical. We're upset. I agree, but we're upsetting white people a lot with these words. We probably need to tone it back a little bit. And then on top of that, this came out around the same time as Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner's, and I'm assuming most of you probably know about Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner was an enslaved African who led one of the bloodiest slave rebellions in American history. Definitely one of the more popular ones. And he killed quite a few white people in his quest for freedom. He literally said single-handedly he was going to attempt to take down the entire system of slavery. And so this Nat Turner's rebellion was big because it scared white Southerners, because they said, wow, if these Black folks get inspired by this and enough of them do it, it's going to be a problem for our way of life. So that's when the laws became harsher. Shortly after that, well, maybe a decade or two after that, you get the Fugitive Slave Act. Like it gets really, really bad for Black people, because that's when things get really harsh, because white folks are afraid these Black folks are resisting violently. All right. So with that, Nat Turner's rebellion, and then at the same time, you have Nat Turner's rebellion going on in the South, and at the same time, you have David Walker's appeal in the North. Ooh, we need a discourse that's a little bit more palatable. Something for everybody to be kind of okay with. But that's why it's interesting, because you can hear echoes of David Walker's appeal in Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech, The Meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro, or What to the Slave is the 4th of July, which goes into our second form of Black social thought. So you have Black nationalism, and then you have civil rights. Now, most people probably know who Frederick Douglass is. Former enslaved African, ran to freedom. He would eventually be a diplomat, a friend to Abraham Lincoln, an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. And I think he would become the ambassador to Haiti, latter part of the 19th century. Okay, Frederick Douglass, big time Black leader. And so he was asked, very interesting, you see elements of what Walker is saying. You see elements of what Walker is saying in Douglass's speech, even though Douglass's speech was decades later. But it's a little bit different. And that's why in reading it, I want you to see the difference between what they're saying, and that's what we're getting ready to talk about. So Douglass, let's see. In his speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, he says the following quote, "For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced." That type of thought, that type of language, that type of oratory is what makes people think Douglass had to have read David Walker's appeal in order to prepare for this speech. Now let's give a little bit of context to why Douglass is giving this speech. So he moved to Rochester in about 1847, and he became the publisher of this very well-known, it was either a newspaper or a magazine called the North Star, right? It was a weekly. And so because he was very well-known, he had been invited to speak to some folks in New York, a lot of white people, may have been some Black people because they had to pay like 12.5 cents to come here and speak, about what the 4th of July means for the American Black population. He was supposed to represent Black people. And they said, hey, we want you to talk about what the 4th of July means to you all. How important this day is. How we should revere this day. How everybody should revere this day. And we know what it means to white people. What does it mean to Black people? This wonderful, beautiful day. And so Douglas thinks about it and he says, huh, you want me to talk about what this day means to me and my people? Okay. And so he starts off the speech. I mean, it's very, very, it's almost kind of funny. I'm just kind of thinking and imagining their faces as he starts off this speech, praising what the founding forefathers did for this country, right? And you can see it, and it's just beautiful. Clearly, this brother has a solid knowledge of the country in which he lives. You would think he was born today and he's just been reading American history books. He's very, very knowledgeable. And he breaks it down so well. And he delineates the history of the United States and how it became this independent nation very, very well. And you can probably just imagine the chest of those people in that audience being puffed up and happy as they're remembering the glory days of independence and how this nation became one and how this nation promotes freedom and equality. And you could just imagine everybody feeling so good in that audience. So Douglas lifts everybody up, brings the sentiments high. And then as the speech goes on, you start to see where he begins to form this condemnation of the attitudes of American society towards slavery. And I could just imagine those same faces and those chests that were puffed up start to deflate. Now they're probably not feeling so good. Because now Frederick Douglass is reminding them that while this day means something to you, it means something totally different to the people that sit next to you, that sleep in the same places as you, on the same land as you, that work for you. While this day is something to be praised, for that other group of people, it is a day of mourning. And because of that, this day is a hypocrisy, and you all are hypocrites. And so he does this in a very well-spoken, well thought out speech called What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And in this speech, he presents these things. He advocates for equal justice and rights as well as citizenship for Black people, right? So he starts off by saying that everybody should have equal rights. And that's fine for these white Northerners, these white liberals. They're okay with that. They're okay with that, with the thought and the rhetoric. Now, how it actually plays out is a different story. So it makes them feel good by that. And then he really makes them feel good when he says that the United States is young and still capable of positive change. This is where you start to see the civil rights path and form of Black social thought very different from Black nationalism. Because he's saying, well, the US is still very young. Now, not even 100 years old. We can still do that. We can still be the nation that can set the example for what it means to be truly equal, a real democracy. And he talks about the history of the American revolutionaries fighting for freedom. Everybody's happy, right? So he does this, and then right after that, he asks this question: are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in the Declaration of Independence extended to us Blacks? Now he's making them nervous. Now he's making them uncomfortable. Because here is where he argues that there is a level of hypocrisy that exists in this country. And so he says, is this same privilege extended to us? Because if not, then does it really exist in its truest form? And at this point is where he transitions the speech from praising America to talking about the hypocrisy of democracy. Now, this is actually again, he doesn't He doesn't outright say it, but that's what he's implying. And that is where this social thought kind of overlaps with Black nationalist thought, because Malcolm X was a Black nationalist. And Malcolm X absolutely said, we do not, one of his famous quotes was that we don't live in a democracy. This isn't a land of democracy, it's a land of hypocrisy, or something of that nature, right? Now, he actually said this out loud, out of his mouth. And Frederick Douglass doesn't really do that, but he implies it, letting people know, oh, I see what's going on. So that's where you see elements of both the Black nationalist tradition and the civil rights tradition going hand in hand. The difference is, in the civil rights tradition, is a little bit more palatable. So, for example, Frederick Douglass starting out, the US is still young and still capable of positive change. I still believe in America. I still want to be an American citizen. Black nationalism doesn't jive with that. David Walker's appeal goes straight out. Stop saying that we're inferior to you, because we're not. African Americans and African history is the same thing. And we came from kings and queens and blah, blah, blah. All right. So civil rights, you start to see there is still this hope for a togetherness for Black people and white people, all under the guise of American principles. So you see Frederick Douglass lifting the people up and then criticizing these same people, these same founders, these same actions. And so he says to the audience, they must fulfill what the founders of the country advocated. And how is this done? First thing you got to do, you got to denounce slavery. Slavery's got to be done away with. That's the first thing you do. That's where you see another similarity between Black nationalism and civil rights. Both denounce slavery. Okay. Also, what we see in the civil rights tradition is that Frederick Douglass condemns the American churches and ministers for not speaking out against slavery. And this is very similar to what early white philosophers also did, whether you're talking about the ones that were in Europe or the ones in the United States. Thomas Paine, Voltaire, Bolingbroke. All of these early philosophers, though white, were also criticized by the church. They were criticized by the church, and they criticized the church for not upholding certain standards, for not publicly speaking out of the freedoms of people that were oppressed. So Frederick Douglass is in the same line as these people, even though they're white. He's saying the same thing that they're saying. And the church sometimes criticized Frederick Douglass as well. There were people that maintained that slavery is a part of the divine plan. And Douglass argues that something which is inhumane cannot be considered divine. He's telling particularly white churches, you can't say that slavery is a part of God's plan. It's inhumane, it's immoral. People are being killed and raped and beaten and split from their families. That's not the God you or I serve. So he considers such a pro-slavery posture to be absolutely blasphemous to God's nature. And it gives cruelty to the idea that you would place these kinds of actions alongside a God that you say is so loving. So Frederick Douglass was very critical of the church. And then he concludes What to the Slave is the 4th of July in a way that, again, signifies that civil rights tradition. He concludes it by, on a positive note, on an optimistic note, saying that I still believe in this country. I still believe in that the anti-slavery sentiments will eventually triumph over the pro-slavery forces. So I still believe in this country. And I believe we can do this together. And that is where you, again, kind of see this civil rights tradition within Frederick Douglass. Not to say that Frederick Douglass also did not embody some Black nationalist ideas, but these two forms of Black social thought, sometimes they overlap and sometimes they go in their separate ways. And I'll show you in a second that it can get complicated. But typically it is these pathways that we see when we think about early American social theory. And I'm talking about Black social thought and feminist theory and that sort of thing because we talked about Marx and Weber and Durkheim the last time. So we talked about the white man, we talked about capitalism, we talked about economics. Now we're going into the race and the gender. Okay. So very, very interesting, very good breakdown of both of those pieces. And so what I want to do is show on this next slide how this now breaks down. So as you can see, you have David Walker's appeal on one side and you have Frederick Douglass on the other side. And it is out of David Walker and this early form of Black nationalism that you get Marcus Garvey. Some of you may have heard of Marcus Garvey, some may not. He was a Black leader. He led the largest Black movement in American history. 9 million people globally in the 1920s, right? And his ideas were very much Black nationalists. His ideas were very much Black people need to get away from white folks and form their own nation in Africa and take back Africa and use their own resources, their own genius, their own education to do and be for themselves. And white people need to use the money that they made off of Black people to give them the money to get the ships and the resources and everything necessary to start off their own life being their own nation. That is along the lines of Black nationalism. That is along the lines of David Walker. And then it is out of Marcus Garvey that you get people like Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael. And so these are more modern leaders in the 1960s and 70s who preach that same rhetoric. So this is one early form of Black American social thought and has led to certain Black and certain theories. And then you have Frederick Douglass on the other hand. Frederick Douglass adopted a lot of David Walker's ideas, but was a little bit more palatable, a little bit more accepting of the American story, a little bit more accepting of American white people. Didn't necessarily want to completely separate, but felt we could work together. We can do this together, right? Still young, the United States is still young, the country is still growing. This is our time to do it right. And so out of this, you get W.E.B. Du Bois. Some people may consider Du Bois as being a part of this frame as well, this path. Why? Because, well, he was part of the bourgeoisie. He went to Harvard. He was very, very light-skinned. And he believed in fighting for civil rights, whereas somebody like a Booker T. Washington believed in doing for self, more self-improvement. I didn't put him under Black nationalism because he wasn't, Booker T. Washington, I don't think he was a Black nationalist. Maybe other people might put him there, but I, as a scholar, would not put him in the Black nationalist tradition, not based on his writings and his actions. But not very much a civil rights person either. He was kind of in the middle, actually. It's kind of interesting, very unique figure. But Du Bois was very much fighting for civil rights. And also believed in voting and working with white people to try to figure out how we can live together harmoniously, all the way up until around the 1950s, and he gave up. I don't want to say he gave up, but he came to the realization, this can't happen. Because he had been fighting for 5 decades on a high level. And he was like, it just can't happen. So he left and moved to Ghana, lived the rest of his life there. He says, no hope. This country is too far gone. Ida B. Wells Barnett, same thing. Civil rights leader, civil rights activists. And then it is out of this tradition that you get Martin Luther King Jr., you get Reverend Al Sharpton, you get Barack Obama. You get leaders who believe in the American story and American democracy. You get people who believe that this is possible, that we can do this together. Black people don't have to create their own nation. Because if everybody truly adheres to the principles of this democracy, we can do this. So it is these two lineages of early American thought that make up Black social thought. And there are even non-Black leaders who fall into this. John Brown, white man, absolutely was part of that early David Walker Black nationalism type of appeal, very much. Non-Black leaders in the civil rights tradition, John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Cesar Chavez, absolutely people who fell more in line with the civil rights tradition. So these ideas and this level of consciousness did not just influence Black people, but people of all racial groups. So what I would like for you to do as an assignment is I would like for you to watch this above link. I was thinking about actually playing it for you, but I think you can just watch it yourselves. It's about 7 minutes long, and I would like for you to type a one-page paper addressing the following ideas. Number one, what is Juneteenth? Some of you may know, some of you may not. What is Juneteenth? Number two, how do you see themes of Walker's appeal, Black nationalism, and Douglas's What to the Slaves for the July civil rights in the creation and celebration of Juneteenth? So I want you to explain the various themes that we just talked about in detail and how this can be seen in the celebration and the creation of this holiday. Okay, based on what is said in the YouTube link. As you listen to this YouTube link, how do you see, what elements that we just talked about on that last slide do you see in the creation and celebration of this holiday? How do you think Walker would respond to Biden making Juneteenth a federal holiday? Would he reject it or accept it? How would he critique it? And then do the same thing for Douglas. How do you think Douglas would respond to Biden making Juneteenth a federal holiday? Do you think he would reject it or accept it? And how would he critique it? So these same differing and similar ideas, apply that to something that is now present, something that literally just happened this summer, where Juneteenth became a federal holiday. So the paper should be double spaced, Times New Roman, 12 font, and the only information that should be at the top of the page is your name, the name of the class, and the title of the essay if you want to put a title for it, okay? The deadline to submit this is Friday, September 3rd at noon, and you submit it under the online assignments portal, okay? So you have until Friday. You should be watching this August 30th, either August 30th or sometime that week of August 30th, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then you should have this completed and updated before September 3rd, that Friday at noon. All right, if you have any questions, you can see me during my office hours, or you can shoot me an email. It's actually quicker, and it'll be more efficient if you come to the office hours. Emails may take a little longer. So, but you have both of those ways to contact me if you need to. All right. So now we are moving on to feminism. So next slide. Is feminism a consciousness or a theory? Okay. Interesting question. Because we talked about kind of Black nationalists and civil rights ideas and early forms of Black thought. Was this, consciousness was a theory. And now we're transitioning into feminism to address the same thing, right? So let us go. So what is feminism? Number one, I really like, and this part of the lecture is based off of Dr. Jamie Canty. She is an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, and a very important scholar in Black feminism, and so as well as queer theory. And so she says that Black feminism, or feminism itself, is a socio-political theory and praxis that places women and women's experiences at the center of all analysis. Okay, so placing women at the center of analysis is part of feminism. Bell Hooks, another very important theoretician and scholar, says that feminism is a movement to end sexism, to end sexist exploitation, and to end oppression. Okay? Not just within gender, but oppression in general. Part of ending oppression is feminism. Rosemary Tong is the author of the 1998 book Feminist Thought, a more comprehensive introduction. And there she provides this kind of overview of the major traditions of feminist theory. And she's a distinguished professor over at UNC Charlotte. And she says that a theory that explains women's oppression and solutions for its elimination is what feminist theory does. It explains women's oppression and solutions for its elimination. And so essentially what feminism is it is an investigation of how women are affected by various forms of oppression, racism, sexism, and classism. So these are the things that feminism does to help explain the conditions that women are forced to live in the United States. But if you go to the next slide, we start to see that feminism, just like how we explain Black social thought, is not a homogenous theory or a monolithic ideology. All feminists don't think alike, just like all Black people don't think alike. And though I gave two like major kind of pathways, you also had Booker T. Washington, who was kind of in the middle. Not all Black people or people who deal with race think alike. Right? It was in another class where we don't go into theory as much as we go into it here, but we talked about systemic racism theory, and then we also talked about racial formation theory, right? So even white people who study race, white and other non-Black people who study race, don't necessarily look at all races being race being something that should be understood in the same way. You got systemic racism, you got racial formation. So simply put, all feminists don't think alike, all people of color don't think alike. And so these ideas are growing. They're growing, they're changing, they're evolving. And it should be okay that they evolve and change and grow. The United States is the same way. It's an evolving country. It changes, it grows. You have Democrats, you have Republicans, but all Democrats don't think the same way. All Republicans don't think the same way. All people don't interpret democracy the same way. Even the Supreme Court, whose very job is to interpret the Constitution, they all don't think the same way. That's why it's 9 of them. All right, so they can hopefully, the vote balances out. Yes, so why do we have these different feminist theories? Because you do have very different feminist theories, right? You have liberal feminism, you have hip hop feminism, you have Black feminism, you have Black queer feminism, you have radical feminism, you have white feminism. It's just all different kinds. You have queer and you have queer. You have all different kinds. All different kinds of theories that can be associated with feminism. So each feminist has a different explanation for women's oppression and different proposed solutions for its elimination. So this is why you see a difference in these feminist theories. They're different because they have different solutions or different proposed solutions. All for the same thing though. So they're all looking at the same goal. Again, just like if you talk about democracy, and the goal for the United States is for everybody to live, to be able to live out life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But Democrats see it as one way, Republicans see it as one way, Independents see it as one way, the Green Party sees it as another way. All right, all these different people see it different ways. All of these are different proposed solutions for the same thing. Every theory of feminism did not have all women in mind. So as feminism began to develop and grow, we start to see where it's good, but you also see where they perpetuate some of the divisions that they're fighting against. They're all about gender equality, but they forget about racial equality. So now you have to have another group that branches off of that. Oh, you also have African feminism as well. right? So every theory of feminism did not have all women in mind. And then each feminist has a different theory about the origins of feminist thought. Each feminist has a different theory about the origins of feminist thought. So some people believe that feminist thought may have started with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Declaration of Sentiments. Some people may say it started with Sojourner Truth Ain't I a Woman. Some people may take it all the way back to, oh, I forgot the event. Was it in Greece? I forgot. I think I talked about it, but I forgot what it was. But yeah, ideas around feminism go even further back than the creation of the United States. Each feminist has a different perspective on who the enemy is. So some people, early white feminists, will say the enemy is men, all men. Black women may say, well, yeah, the enemy is white men because they have definitely done a number on me and my people, but you're also the enemy too. I can't really trust you either. And then queer theory feminists may say, well, yeah, I agree. Definitely white men, definitely a lot of white women, but then also these straight people that are also people of color are also our enemy or can be the enemy. So I gotta watch out for them too. I remember for my dissertation, I was interviewing a Black male and he was gay, and he talked about just that. Talked about Black spaces and how he enjoyed to go to the barbershop, and the barbershop was where the Black man can just kind of be himself and talk openly and freely. This was before COVID. And then he said, but I hear so much homo negative rhetoric, and it just makes me so uncomfortable. And I'm just like, man, just when I'm getting comfortable with my people, I hear bad language. I hear language that reminds me sometimes they can treat me just as bad as white people. That was that initial thought he had. And that's fair. Right? So different perspectives and different people have different ideas around who the enemy might be. So if women are different, then our definition of feminism will be different as well. As women change, as women develop, as women are dynamic, right? Feminism becomes dynamic. So feminism is an evolutionary theory and a praxis that changes, and it comes in waves. And with this wave, you have the first wave of feminism, and then you have the second wave of feminism. Now, the first wave of feminism is what we're going to be discussing here with the Declaration of Sentiments, right? That's kind of the first wave. And then the second wave is where you get like Betty Friedan's work, the feminist mystique. That is where you get the origins of life, Kunt's work, which isn't like explicitly feminist, but it deals with feminism. Yeah, so yeah, that's where you get the feminist mystique. That's where you get Kunt's work, the origins of life. Yeah, any other pieces. Around the second wave is where you start to get the Kambachi collective, the Kambachi or the Kambahi collective, can't remember. So yeah. But we're gonna focus more on the first wave. So this first wave, written by Simone de Beauvoir, I believe that's how you pronounce that, Beauvoir. The Second Sex is what she was a French writer, philosopher, and an existentialist, and she's considered to be the pioneer of feminist theory in general. And this analysis transcended ethnicity and transcended culture, and it highlights the complexities of what it means to be a woman. All right, highlights these complexities. And again, this comes from the ideas found in the first wave. Comes from the ideas found in the first wave, right? And some of the famous quotes of it were, but first we must ask, what is a woman? Woman is womb. One is not born, rather becomes a woman, and woman is sex. So these are very early ideas around that can be found in the first wave of feminism, that can be found in the days of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that can be found in the days of Susan B. Anthony, that Simone is kind of taking and running with. Really, the Declaration of Sentiments is probably more accurately a reflection of this first wave. And so in the second section, she just kind of expands on those ideas. Then you go to Betty Friedan in the Feminist Mystique, which is a part of the second wave of feminism. And the second wave, Betty Friedan is an American feminist writer and activist. And she's considered the mother of the second wave feminist movement with this groundbreaking work in the early 1960s, the Feminist Mystique. So she was the co-founder and first president of the National Organization for Women. Some of the famous quotes in the Feminist Mystique, if you are one who studies gender or who wants to study feminism, definitely you need to read and know very well the Feminist Mystique. Just like anybody who studies race and racial theories, you know, at its very foundation, you need to read The Souls of Black Folk by Du Bois. Right, these are just key pieces, right? If you're gonna, you know, expand sociology and, you know, if you want to get a PhD in it and all of that. So famous quotes, ideas, the problem with no name. Who knows what women can be when they are finally free to become themselves? Who knows what women's intelligence will contribute when it can be nourished without denying love? So these are the ideas that are coming out of the second wave of feminism. Some people say we're in the second wave. Some people argue we're in the third wave. Just depends on what you read. So feminism, when we're looking at this first wave, it's derived from what we talked about in when you all read that link. When you all were looking at those themes in the Enlightenment period, those themes encourage the departments of, or encourage the disciplines of sociology. It influenced the creation of US principles in democracy, and it absolutely influenced and encouraged and inspired the feminist movement. It was derived from the liberalism of these early political thinkers. And it focused on how human beings had these natural rights. Natural rights, that is a theme that is found a lot in the Declaration of Independence. These natural rights to life, liberty, and notice they said property. Remember, no, we didn't talk about that in this class, but property. Later, they changed it to pursuit of happiness. But life, liberty, and property was a coded word for who? Black people. Anytime you see property, and especially those early works, that is the way, those were the ways in which early founders, early American leaders, early US leaders were trying to justify slavery. If you read Fagan's Racist America, you see where he talks about that. Property is the main object of society. And saying slavery in those documents would make America look bad, make the US look bad. So oftentimes they would use things like property, right? So life, liberty, and property, later on it was changed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberalism started as a result of the Age of Enlightenment with John Locke. All right, so you had philosophers like John Locke who helped to usher in the Age of Enlightenment and these ideas. Again, you read about that in the Enlightenment period in that section that helped to inspire liberal feminism. Right. So liberal feminism arose because of the notion that human beings were equal. Liberal feminists believe that men and women, liberal feminists believe that men and governments were the enemy to women's rights. They were the cause of women's oppression. Both men and even governments that were largely ran by men, but then sometimes you may have a woman who, I don't even think they had any women government leaders at this time, at least definitely not in the United States. I'm trying to think that they have any in other countries. I'm not sure. Maybe. You had queens, you had women leaders. I don't know, but definitely not in the United States. So men, government, same thing. And they believe those were our enemies. So this first wave of feminism, they were concerned with making sure we demonstrate that women are equal and just as fully human as men. That was the point, right? That was the point. And so inside the Declaration of Sentiments, you read that, or you should have read it. And this is where we start to see these themes. So we'll go over these themes here, just like we did with the appeal to the colored citizens and what to the slave is the 4th of July. Declaration of Sentiments started in 1848. And it modeled the Declaration of Independence. Modeled the Declaration of Independence. It argued that the signers are justified in their call to resist their government. That was one of the things that was said in the Declaration of Independence. If your government is mistreating you, you have a right as a citizen, you have a right as a full human being to resist that government. So the United States, or so women are saying, hey, that's us. We're resisting because we're not being treated fairly. And you said we have the right to do that. And you said that not only do we have the right, the national right, we have an inalienable right, a human right to do this. So now you are on the opposite side of that resistance. And so asserting the equality of all men and women reiterates that both genders are endowed with these unalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Everybody has a right to that. And so in showing that women were not receiving that, could not just be done by saying, hey, we're being treated unfairly. They had to actually list ways in which this is done. And so that's what they do. In the Declaration of Sentiments, I think you all only saw just again, a snippet of it, but they lay it all the way out. The extent of this oppression goes to the lack of women's suffrage. We can't vote. That's number one. We should be allowed to vote for people that represent us, especially when women make up a large, if not a majority of the population. It's not fair. Participation in society, participation in the economy, opportunities for advancement, representation in the government. If we're going to vote, we also need to have the opportunity to run for office and make sure that we are represented when these laws are passed, when these bills are passed, so that we can have policies that protect our interests. Women's lack of property rights in a marriage. Property didn't go to women. Property went to men. If you didn't have a son, brother, uncle, some man, women said that's not right. Even all the way up until I think it was the 1970s, women could not fill out a credit application to get a credit card by herself. She had to get one with her husband. Her husband, I think in the 70s, the late 70s was when that was done away with. And if you know anything about finances, you need credit, and good credit, that follows you throughout your life. So women's lack of property rights in marriage, inequality in divorce law. In divorce law, men got everything, women didn't get a lot. Nothing, really. So women could be mistreated in any way they want to, and men always had the upper hand. Inequality in education. Women didn't have the opportunities to go to school and get an education. Inequality in employment opportunities. If they couldn't get an education and they couldn't get those jobs, that could lead to mobility. And even in the poor jobs, many times those were taken up by men. Women just kind of had to sit and wait to be connected to a man that hopefully would help them live a life that they would want. So these were the issues that women addressed, and many, many, many more. These are just some of the issues that women addressed in the Declaration of Sentiments. This is very, very important because, again, this lays the foundation for early feminist social thought, lays the foundation for feminist ideas. So then the question remains, okay, well, if this is feminism, this is early US social thought, all of these issues are issues that, yes, are affecting women, but what group is being left out? If you look at all of those things that were just laid out, what type of woman is largely affected by these issues? And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the women that were left out were Black women. Because the lack of women's suffrage. Okay, so Black women are saying, okay, well, if you get the right to vote, that still leaves me out because Black people can't vote. And the white feminists are the white feminists are saying, oh, sorry, I didn't think about that part. Participation. So if you get to participate, okay, let's say that the men do pass a law where women get to participate. I still can't participate because I'm not just a woman, I'm also Black. Oh, we didn't think about that. Representing in government, can't do that either, even if they do pass this law. Lack of property rights, I'm considered property. So even if you get rights to property, that means you get rights to me. We got to address, oh, I didn't think about that either. Rights in property rights in marriage, it's illegal for us to get married. We have to have our own married ceremonies because our marriages aren't even seen as being legal. Oh, I forgot about that. Divorce law, we can't even get married. Inequality in education, it's illegal for us to read. Inequality in employment opportunities, we don't get paid to work. None of these things apply to Black women. And the response by a lot of white feminists during that time was, oh, well, let us get this, and then we can bring Black women on. And Black women are like, no, that don't sound right. That don't sound right. Because all of these things that y'all stated, if by some miracle these men pass all these laws, I'm still in the same position and you all are now equal and aren't willing to grapple with that. So Black women said, we got to do our own thing. And so if you look at it, if you look at this excerpt from Sojourner Truth's speech in the 1851 Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, she says this exact thing. She says, well, ain't I a woman? I'm a woman as well. Look at me. Look at my arm. I've plowed and I've planted and I've gathered into barns and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could ask as much. I'm sorry, I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it and bear the lash as well. Ain't I a woman? I've borne children and seen most of them sold into slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? So Sojourner Truth is saying, do you see my Blackness or do you see my womanness? And does my Blackness negate my womanness? Because being a part of this feminist movement, it feels like I'm just as much of an outsider here as I am in the regular world. And so this ain't I a woman trope, this ain't I a woman speech became the foundation for early forms of Black feminism and became the foundation for Black feminist thought and what Collins would put forth. Because out of Sojourner Truth and out of the writings of Sojourner Truth and Harriet Jacobs Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl and Harriet Tubman and many of these other early Black women, that's where you get Anna Julia Cooper's Voices from the South. And that then becomes the souls of Black folk of Black feminism. That's it right there. In terms of the early times, Black feminist thought is probably that's up there now as well. But Black feminism would be nothing without Anna Julia Cooper's work. And Collins would say that. Collins would definitely give love and appreciation and value as her work is an extension of what Dr. Cooper did. Dr. Cooper, a Black woman, got a PhD. And I think she was born in the 19th century. And then, continued to do her work in the 20th century. Okay. So, Ain't I a Woman? Yes. This helped to formulate early Black feminist thought. Yes, here we go. And so it is out of Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman that you get Maria Stewart, right? That you get Maria Stewart, an early essayist, an abolitionist, a women's rights activist, who called upon African Americans to organize against slavery in the South, resist racist restrictions in the North. You get Ida B. Wells, Barnett, one of the founders of the NAACP, again, Anna Julia Cooper. All of these individuals were considered race women because they focused on race, but also included gender and sex in the discrimination as well. So part of the real work of feminism is done with these women, because these women are saying now we can have a much more comprehensive discussion because more and more people are included. And then even still, there are other people that get kind of denied. That's where you have queer feminist theory and so on. But Black feminism helps to expand this to people of all colors, people of all racial backgrounds. And so essentially, this is where the Declaration of Sentiments both uphold the democracy as well as challenge the democracy, and then put itself in a position to also be challenged by further democratic and egalitarian ideas and movements. So this covers the first three readings, and then we kind of went into Collins' work as well. We didn't break that one down as much, but what I would like for you to do is I would like for you to engage in the discussion board post where that can be found in the discussion board link. And the post is entitled Early American Social Thought. And if you go to the syllabus, you'll see the instructions for how I want you to respond to these discussion board posts. And you're going to answer the following questions. What do Collins, which is the author of the last reading that Black Feminist Thought, and Zora Neale Hurston mean when they say Black women are the mule of the world? So if you read that work, you would know what she's talking about. Black women are the mule of the world. What do they mean? What does she mean by that? How does Collins contextualize the racial, class, and gendered effects of Black women's work? All right. In what ways do we see this same level of oppression in the present? We know that these things happened in the past, particularly in the 19th century, and even when Collins wrote Black Feminist Thought in the early 90s. But how do we see it in 2021? 30 years later, after Collins wrote Black Feminist Thought. How do Black women resist both the racism and sexism that is explained in Black Feminist Thought? So all these instructions, everything that I tell you to do in early American social thought, on that, I'm not what I tell you to do in the syllabus, where I want you to write a post, and there are things that I want you to complete in that post, and then you have to respond to another student. I want you to complete those instructions before noon on September 6th. Before noon on September 6th, okay? So I'm not sure when you're gonna watch this, but you should watch this within the, this will be posted on the 30th of August. And so from August 30th to September 6th, I believe is a week. So you got some time. And you can do it up until that time. And then after that time, it's late. And then there's a late assignment or there are late there are implications, negative implications for submitting your work late. So yes, this is the lecture for kind of a series of lectures for the week. So this deals with those readings. You have a few assignments to do. You have your reflection on the Juneteenth reflection that you can turn in under online assignments. It's not a reflection paper. Well, yeah, it's not a reflection paper. Turn it in under online assignments. I should probably call it something else. I'll just say Juneteenth assignment, because if I say reflection, people are gonna Juneteenth online assignment. Let me make that clear. Online assignment. It's not a reflection paper. Let me write that down as well. This is not a reflection paper. A reflection paper. Do not submit under reflection. Do not submit under reflection paper on Canvas. So hopefully that is clear. Hope people are not confused by that. The reason why I call it a reflection is just you're reflecting on this idea, but I don't want you to confuse this with being a reflection paper. So it says Juneteenth reflection, but I'm going to scratch that out. I'm going to scratch that out altogether and just put online assignment. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. If there are any questions, so you have that, and then you also have your discussion board assignment. And if you have any other questions, I can be reached via email, or I can be reached via, or you can just come into my office hours. All right, with that being said, hopefully you have a great week, and you will see me soon, and hopefully I see you in the office hours, or I'll speak with you via email.